Okay, good evening, everyone. I'm Annette Insdorf. Usually I introduce myself as the moderator of Real Pieces here at the 92nd Street Y, but tonight I'm introducing myself in a more personal way as a friend of Dr. Ruth Westheimer. I had the good fortune to know her for over 4 decades. The last time that I saw her was on June 4th, 2024, at her 96th birthday party at the home of her friend Patty Kenner. And that's where, that's where I got to meet Allison Gilbert. I should bring out the panelists before I continue. If you are within earshot, I just started talking as if you were already here. Joel Westheimer, Dr. Ruth's son. Miriam Westheimer, Dr. Ruth's daughter. Pierre Lehu. Now, Pierre has always been called by Dr. Ruth her Minister of Communications. For many, many decades, he was the one who managed not only her promotion, her social schedule, her interviews, but really everything about her professional life. I know you wouldn't dare think that it went beyond that into her managing personal life. She would never have allowed it. And also Allison Gilbert, who is the co-author of The Joy of Connections. This is what we are celebrating tonight, the last book that Dr. Ruth wrote. I mean, after all, there were, 39 books in all? And this one was the last thing that she... 46. It was 46 books? Ay caramba. I was certain that it was hovering around 40, but I guess I missed a few.
I only wrote 26 of them with her.
Okay, only 26. That's something. So it was at that 96th birthday party that I met Allison Gilbert for the first time. And it was a joyous event. She was still feisty and in good shape. And when she passed away a few weeks later, it was peacefully with her family by her side. We waited a little bit before doing an event in her honor, but now that this book is finally available, we are going to have a book selling and signing immediately after our onstage conversation. And at the same time, in this space, there will be a reception. And I want to sincerely thank Renee Edelman, who is sponsoring the reception in honor of what we're doing for Dr. Ruth at the 92nd Street Y. And I will only say one more thing about how I met Dr. Ruth before we watch a short video, because people wonder, what kind of cinematic connection did she have to somebody who spends her life watching and talking about films? Well, I met Dr. Ruth in 1984 when she was acting in a film. It was called One Woman or Two. It was for the French director Daniel Vigne, who had previously made the masterpiece, The Return of Martin Guerre. He and I became friendly after I interviewed him for the New York Times, and he invited me to the set in New York where they were shooting this film starring Gérard Depardieu and Sigourney Weaver. Dr. Ruth played a character who was jogging on a rooftop while dictating to her assistant who could barely keep up with her. Daniel Vigne introduced us, we hit it off, and we planned to meet again. And I will tell you more about that after we see a 5-minute video. I should mention that it came to us from our friend Judd Newborn, the curator at the Cinema Arts Center in Huntington. And this is from her 91st birthday party that was celebrated in that space. We're going to take a look at that, and then I will come back. It'll be up on that screen.
What could be better than to celebrate the 91st birthday at the Cinema Arts Center of Dr. Ruth Westheimer?
Here is a cartoon. I'm saying to the president of North Korea and to the president of the United States, relax, size does not matter.
We're going to see the hit of the 2019 Sundance Film Festival, the documentary about her called Ask Dr. Ruth, and it covers her entire life, and you'll see things you didn't know anything about her, like she was a Holocaust child orphan. She was a sniper during the Israeli War of Independence in 1948. She went through 2 husbands before she found the 3rd one. She's a culture shaper, not just a culture receiver.
At 90, still talking about sex from morning till night. It's very nice to be celebrated by the world, and guess what? I'm very concerned about loneliness, and I'm very concerned about the art of conversation is getting lost because everybody's on their phones. I see a short person over there. I have to tell you that short people make the best lovers. In the Jewish tradition, it says that a lesson taught with humor is a lesson retained. This book that I did for children, it talks about my taking 2 of my grandchildren to an amusement park, and we get measured to go on a ride. They can go on the ride and I'm too short. I don't deal in politics. I vote, but I don't do politics because somebody who talks about orgasm and election all day long should not talk about politics. I changed my mind these days. I talk about how upset I am that children are being separated from their parents, because that's my story. At the age of 10 and a half, being separated from my parents, and I never saw my parents again. The other thing that I changed my mind, I speak up that abortion must remain legal, otherwise only women with money could obtain an abortion. So it's very nice for me to, on the one hand, have a documentary that I love very much, and on the other hand, to be able to speak up and to say we have to be courageous and stand up and be counted.
People look up to you as a feminist role model.
Okay, that's all right. I don't want them to change their mind.
I'm a member of Cinema Arts, and we're like, we have to meet Dr. Ruth. I think because she's a symbol of empowerment and feminism.
I thought nobody's ever going to marry me. I'm short. I thought that I was ugly.
Learning that she was a single mom and had 2 marriages, and then the 3rd marriage really stuck, was something that I didn't know about her at all.
Everyone was murdered in the Holocaust.
Sad. My mother, there is no date of death. It just says the word verschollen, which is a horrible word. Verschollen means disappeared.
It wasn't that long ago that 6 million Jews were murdered. The fact that she was taken from her parents and grew up in an orphanage, it's incredibly important to keep it alive and to have people like Dr. Ruth discuss it and be who she is.
I could talk about Dr. Ruth and the history of our friendship for at least an hour, but knowing that the people on this panel have so much more important things to say, I'm going to move over and, assuming that this works, segue into my role as moderator. And if we have time, I can always tell you a little bit more about the deep and warm relations that Dr. Ruth had, not only with my mother, Dr. Cecile Insdorf, a Holocaust survivor herself. By the way, they met at a screening of Sex, Lies, and Videotape in Midtown, in the ladies' room afterwards, realizing they were the oldest people in the room, and they had commonalities, and Dr. Ruth offered her a ride home. And this was around the same time that I had become friendly separately with her. And then she took a real liking to my husband, Mark Toporek, because, among other things, he's an actor. And with us, she didn't talk sex, certainly didn't talk politics, but did she love to talk movies and actors in particular. More on that later. I'm going to start by asking about the actual process of writing the book. In other words, was it primarily Ruth speaking and then the 2 of you transcribing and editing? And how long did that take?
Sure. Can I just start by saying what an honor it is to be in this company? I feel honored and at the same time the odd person out, because I only met Dr. Ruth towards an important and yet vital, but yet towards the end of her life. And I look out here, and I know so many of you have your relationships, personal, professional, family, and it does feel quite an honor to be talking about a book, but knowing that the stories that you must have, you guys should also be sitting up here with us today. I came to know Ruth when she was just only 95. I was given an assignment by the New York Times. I'm a writer and a journalist to write about her quest to become New York State's ambassador to loneliness. Just so you know, no one just raises their hand to say that, pick me, I want to be the ambassador to loneliness, a made-up position that did not exist, and yet it was successful, her campaign. And so she became the ambassador to loneliness, the first such role in the United States. That's a shorthand about how I entered Dr. Ruth's incredible life. And the book was an outgrowth of this incredible responsibility that she asked for, that she wanted. She had something to say for all the reasons that were so evident in that video. She knew loneliness as an orphan of the Holocaust, and she knew loneliness as a widow. And the book was an outgrowth of her sharing these, what became her final lessons.
And one of the most important things that she had to say for the book is look in the mirror and say to yourself, I am lonely. Because if you don't admit to being lonely, you're never going to come up with a cure. You're never going to come up with any manner of activity that's going to help you. Coming home and turning on the television and kind of wasting an evening so that you're not lonely, well, the same thing's going to hit you the next day. So that was the first thing that she said, and then we worked together. As Miriam and Joel were talking about, they're going through the apartment, and the stuff that Freddie had together was all alphabetized and dated and whatever. That wasn't Ruth. Ruth was not an organized person. It was partially my job to help keep her organized, and we barely were able to do that. But Ruth, Allison, and I worked together to come up with ideas, and the actual structure of the book, the main idea of the way it was structured was Allison's idea. It's your idea, you should take credit here.
Thank you. So this book, if you looked back on one of my books called Past and Present, Keeping Memories of Loved Ones Alive, that is 85 ideas for celebrating and honoring those who we've loved and who we've lost. And the act of remembering is actually an act of defiance. It's an act of power and agency, because we lose that when we are in grief. No matter how much we anticipate loss, the time of death is always out of our control. And so the objective of Past and Present was to reclaim agency in remembering and honoring and keeping heirlooms, keeping objects, repurposing them so they can have a life and keep the stories going. And so since it was all about agency, and since it was all about being direct and not mincing words, and it was very Dr. Ruthy without me knowing Dr. Ruth yet at that point. I was still a fan before I was a collaborator, but it seemed like the structure was just about perfect.
And then we certainly were not in the room when they had these meetings. That was never mixing family and work was never going to happen to the very end. But I can say how important those weekly meetings were for her last year. That we had a calendar up and we had appointments, and every week she knew that they were coming to work on the book, and that kept her going all week. And if anyone was going to come, even 2 hours before, Allison and Pierre were supposed to show up, she said, no, I'm busy. I have work to do. I have a meeting. And that was absolutely critical. So I think the book is a fantastic book, but I'm as grateful for the process and the place that that experience held for her in the last year of her life.
Just one example of what Miriam was saying. I took her to Fort Tryon Park at one point. It was 10 a.m. and at 10:30 she said, "We have to go back because Pierre and Allison were coming at 1." And I also just want to say that if our mother were here, she would start naming and thanking every single person in the audience that she knew. And there are so many people who were so important to her. But I do just want to say that Cliff Rubin is here, and he was the other person who kept her organized.
I glimpsed earlier the truly very, I can't see everyone, but I did see Jeff Tabak and Mati Lazar, and now I see Patty Kenner, who I mentioned, that was the last time I saw Ruth, was at your place for her birthday. She had so many friends. It is amazing because public figures, I think, rarely devote as much time to family and friends as she did. She would, when she was very healthy, let's say up until 3-4 years ago, she would call Mark and me all the time just to say hi, just to make sure we're all right, to say Shabbat Shalom on a Friday. And after she started getting weaker, we called her. But that's not a typical thing for people who have her kind of profile and visibility.
Well, friendship to her was so important because she'd lost her family, and to her, this was her new family, and she cultivated this family and thought very highly of this family. And I'm going to tell a story that's a little weird, but you probably all remember Regis Philbin. He had a television show here, and he brought it to New York, and Ruth was on it, and she thought Regis was probably lonely, and so she invited him to a party at her apartment in Washington Heights. And Regis and Joy, his wife, probably thought they were going to some sort of celebrity Phil party, whatever. And it was all her friends. That's all she thought that Regis and Joy would want to make friends with her friends. And let me tell you, Regis and Joy didn't stick around at the party.
They were not happy.
They left pretty quickly, but it was a good party and everybody had a good time despite that. So, you know.
And the number of parties that our mother threw under any circumstances, I mean, relationships were so important to her because that was one of the most important things. And so she cultivated them. And she would always say that you need to cultivate relationships. And we always laugh because, the house, as you've heard, was not the most organized house in the world. And there were piles of paper all over. And that would not stop her from throwing a party. She would just throw a sheet over the piles of paper and call it a ski slope. and there was the party. But our house was always filled with lively engagement.
That reminds me of just one piece of practical advice from the book, which I think is so brilliant, which is get over yourself and keep hosting if you're not invited to places. That if you start being resentful that you are always the host and the invitations are not reciprocated, your goal at the end of the day is never reciprocity. That is a ledger in your head that will never put you out in front where you want to be. You're getting in the way of social connection by keeping this invisible scorecard. So what she would say, and we talk about this in the book, lose count. Be the host. You are never going to know why someone can't have you over. Maybe they can't afford the one extra bottle of soda and bag of chips. Maybe they're embarrassed by the size of their living room. So just have an event because you want to be with people who you care about and lose count.
And another point in the book, which is very similar to that, there are people who won't go to family events because they don't like one cousin or whatever it is. And so they cut themselves off from their family, and family is so important if you don't want to be lonely. So, just Try to stay away from that person at family events, but go to that family event. Don't lock yourself out of it just because there's one person that annoys you.
I have a question for Joel and Miriam, and it's based on the fact that I was fortunate enough to interview Dr. Ruth twice at the 92nd Street Y, and once introducing another program. I interviewed her at the Jerusalem Film Festival, and I wrote down almost everything that she said. I would take notes, and I asked her, where does your resilience come from? And she answered, growing up in a loving Orthodox family, unquote. So for both of you, to what extent did she raise you in a loving Jewish family, at least? In other words, how important was that in your own upbringing?
So our home was very Jewish, very not Orthodox, but very Jewish. And holidays were very important. And doing things, activities together as a family was very important, with the emphasis on activity, doing things, going out, moving around. It wasn't a lot of just sitting home, the four of us, for a quiet evening. That was probably not high on her list of, of favorite activities. But the family together with lots of other people and interesting conversations. Having a Jewish environment in the home was extremely important to her, even though it had actually, we went, when we were little, we would go to synagogue twice a year, like many American Jews. So it wasn't about the religion as much as about the culture and the experiences, and for sure the commitment and love of Israel. That was always high. We went to Israel many times, so her raising a Jewish family was very connected to her experiences in Israel and her wanting us to have those experiences in Israel. And I ended up making Aliyah and living in Israel for 7 years and also serving in the army. So, I took some of that on for sure, and give her credit for that. She did say sometime to me that she wanted me to be, a feminist and a Zionist, but not such a feminist and not such a Zionist. So I didn't have to move to Israel. Didn't have to always insist on, paying my way when I went out. But
just on that, a little window into her personality and the way she was thinking. Miriam and I both went to private school. Our parents sent us to private school. But because she didn't want us to only have that experience with being around fairly well-to-do people in a particular kind of culture, she was very set on sending us to a camp that was a socialist Zionist youth camp. And actually there's 2 people here from that youth movement. And she wanted us to have that balance. It was important that it was a Jewish camp, but also she wanted us to have that balance of culture. You asked about resilience, Annette, and I think that one of the ways that she chose to be resilient is through the question you asked before, through relationships. Now there's, shelves and shelves of literature, books on how to be happy, right, in every bookstore. And one of the lessons of all those books is you do things for others and connect to others. And she operated with, even since we knew this, but since she died, the number of people who said that, total strangers to us, who said that she got them a job. She encouraged them to go to college. She encouraged them to go to graduate school. It's because of her they became a doctor. It's because of her. Every single person she met, she wanted to help in some way. And she had incredible integrity in the way that she interacted with people. There was no difference between the way that she opened herself up to Bill Clinton or to the janitor or a waiter in a restaurant. She always treated people with incredible integrity and respect. And I think that outward focus gives you a lot of resilience.
She had one of the most democratizing spirits that I've ever come across. sometimes I have been in the presence of celebrities and we're talking privately, and someone will come up and want to talk to that person, and the celebrity will say, "I'm sorry, I'm in conversation." I have never seen Ruth not respond to even a stranger coming up. She will always make time. She was not just a public media figure, she was a mensch. It's that simple. Yeah. She treated every single person that came into her purview, her path, her eyes, the same. And
which sometimes wasn't so fun for us.
It's also a bit, by the way, unnerving. I don't know if I've ever shared this with you, but I walked into the first time ever meeting your mom. It was August of 2023. You were there as the gatekeeper, publicist. I was there from the New York Times as my recorder and taking notes for this article. And I have to go back to the audio tape, as Warner Wolf would say from Channel 2 News long ago. But I believe it would be true that for the first 12 minutes or so of the audio tape, I could not ask a question. It was more about, where are you from? Where do you live? When did you get married? Tell me about your children. How old are they? And at first, that is very atypical. Because when you go in to interview someone,
she was deciding if she was going to give you the interview, Allison.
I know. But that warmth that I felt in that moment was something that I was not expecting. And I think that is the magic of Ruth, why we're here to celebrate her.
Now, I attended a lovely talk about this book. It was in September, moderated by Bill Ritter from ABC News. And I wrote down, Joel, something that you said that I just found remarkable. You quoted Maxine Breen, that, and this was in the context of your mother's efforts, to comfort the troubled and to trouble the comfortable. Yeah. And that stayed with me for a long time. I was unpacking it for the next hour or so. Could you elaborate a little bit on that in terms of your mom? And I realized that maybe my question earlier about the Jewish values was too limited. Maybe you could also include what are the core values that she instilled in both of you.
So Maxine Green, the quote from her was, the purpose of education is to trouble the comfortable, is to comfort the troubled and trouble the comfortable. But I think you're absolutely right. It applied to my mom. Comforting the troubled, I think we've already spoken a little bit about. She cared about people, and she always wanted to offer comfort to those who were upset for some reason. And you can hear that in every call to her radio show over the years that she did that. She wanted to offer comfort. But trouble the comfortable was also something, the little video clips showed her saying that she's not political because if you talk about sex, you can't be political. What she means by that is electoral politics. But she was very political in the sense that she cared about power relationships. She cared about social justice. She cared about troubling the comfortable, which means those who are too comfortable, who don't see that there are still problems in the world and that it's part of their role to help solve those problems. You need to stir things up a little. You need to trouble them. There's a famous story where she's sitting with Kissinger at some gathering, and they're a dinner at the German embassy, and someone says something about how we need to reduce immigrants and we need to, close the borders, which we won't talk about what's going on right now. And Kissinger echoed in on something like that. And my mother said, if that were the policy, I would not be here. And you wouldn't be here, right. And she said that straight to him. So Yeah. So one of her core values, I think, is social justice, even though she wouldn't use those terms. Another value is integrity, and another one is treating people with incredible respect and finding something interesting about them. And I was fine up here until my niece Leora started crying, and that's what's made it hard for me.
I loved what he said.
Me too. Pierre, I want to ask you and then Allison, what do you think was her greatest contribution to our society? Because you got to see the effects, not just the process.
I think before there was a Dr. Ruth, we didn't really talk about sex. It was a taboo subject. And it's kind of amazing that, I mean, her first program was 15 minutes, Sunday nights at 12:15. That's all they would allow it. But, and what's, okay, what I think is a funny story is, so how did it go from this 15-minute show to an hour show Sunday nights at 10 with live call-ins? I just found that out this past summer. Frank Osborne, who was the station manager, came to visit Ruth, you know, because she was sick in the apartment, and I was talking to him. And he explained to me that he was trying to sell advertisements on WYNY. And everybody he went to was saying, oh, we want to take ads on that sex show. He didn't have a sex. It was a 15-minute public affairs program. There was no advertisements. So he was forced to give her a show so he could sell the ads. You know, so her contribution, yes. I mean, again, the story of how she got on the air to begin with was that the public service managers would get together once a month for all the radio stations, and they invited somebody else who didn't want to speak, and Ruth said, okay, I'll speak. And out of that, they decided to interview her, just an interview on a news program, and out of that came the 15-minute show. So there were, some people took, for brave reasons, took the step to give her some airtime, and then it was financial that did the rest.
You know, Annette, what moves us to no end is the amount of people that stop us, particularly gay men in their 60s and 70s now, who say, your mother saved our life. And what she did during the AIDS crisis was just extraordinary on the air. You know, we don't judge, you know, what people do in the privacy of their home is, and I think that was huge. In fact, today, we donated the big gown that she wore for La Cage aux Folles fundraiser in the 70s. There was a big fundraiser for AIDS research. And we donated to the Museum of Broadway. And they're putting it in the hall on, you know, memory of the AIDS crisis.
I think there's another half to the answer to your question, though, is how did she affect things? At least is my belief, not having been researched, but I think women's sexuality has vastly improved because of Dr. Ruth. Women were able to ask for or even demand an orgasm out of sex, which before it was, you know, slam, bam, thank you, ma'am, and that was the end of that. And I think our culture has changed vastly because of that.
I'm going to leave that point there, but what I will but what I will say too is that from my processing Dr. Ruth more newly, what I saw as the threads that connected her work in the 80s and the work that we are privileged to work with her on the loneliness epidemic. What is the connective tissue? People often ask us as we're promoting the joy of connections. And the connective tissue is so obvious, I think, once you think about it. Nobody wanted to raise their hand in public to say that they were engaging in homosexual sex then. There was taboo, there was stigma, and I would imagine if I asked you to raise your hands in here, how many of you are disappointed in the types of friendships you have? How meaningful the relationships are in your life? Few might be willing to raise their hand publicly because there's shame attached to not feeling that you're connected well enough. Or maybe you're in a partnership and you feel invisible in your own home. Maybe you live in New York City and you're surrounded by tens of thousands of people, of course, throughout the entire day, and yet you feel like you don't matter. So the connective thread is shame, taboo, and Dr. Ruth, I feel like being the ultimate nutcracker of cracking it all open for us to see in front of us what's inside so we can talk about it, reflect about it, and feel that we are more empowered because of it. Yeah.
And I remember how at that September gathering, you were the one who said, and obviously Miriam just mentioned this, the destigmatizing of AIDS. And at that time also, I would say that she removed shame from the people who were most vulnerable at that time. I would add that same-sex marriage is crucially informed by her work, and that she has always engaged in a kind of contemporary redefinition of family. What does family mean? Obviously, we're all familiar with the idea of biological family, but I believe that she talked more about reparenting, about repairing, that it wasn't a question of birth DNA and all that. You can also choose your family. You can make the connections and the relationships as close to you as possible.
And towards the end, she had an idea for a project. She really wanted to connect elderly people with young people who needed someone to talk to just to be there, a grandparent. And she was really intent on moving that project forward. And we just went, Allison and I and our partners, to the Renaissance Weekend, where we met a fabulous woman who has started an organization, Dana Griffin, who started an organization called
Eldera.
Eldera, thank you. And Eldera is doing exactly that. It is a national effort to bring mentors, elderly people who have time on their hands and have experience and want to be involved in the lives of young people. And I think there may be somebody here from Eldera, I don't know, but if there is, put your hand up, because afterwards we can reach out to you. But Dana said that she's really eager to connect with us more because she wants, this is a perfect extension of the kinds of things that you talk about in the book in terms of creating connections and ways to use technology to make that happen.
The interesting thing about the work is that if you look at who experiences loneliness the most profoundly, it's a U-graph. So it's young adults and older folks. And so these are the populations that is the sweet spot of what Eldera is trying to solve for. On the older person front, that is where she needs the most people. The kids are signing up in droves. And what's fabulous about this idea is that so many times in the senior living communities where we are speaking about this book, the feeling of not mattering anymore once you retire, the feeling that you've lost the ability to contribute, is really demoralizing, and there's a physical consequence to this. Being lonely can take as much time off your life as smoking up to 15 cigarettes a day. It contributes to dementia and anxiety and cardiovascular disease. It increases the rate of premature mortality. So we are talking about this as a big problem, not just because we don't feel connected, right? It's not just this soft feeling like it'd be nice to solve if we could. There's this real shift of how it's contributing to our early deaths and the quality of our lives. And so if you or someone who you know want to be a part of Eldera, they are looking for this population to feel valued and valuable. And you are, and kids need you, and young adults need your wisdom.
And that's ELD. ELD.
ELDERA.AI.
And I think it stands for the era of the elder, Eldera. And I'm not a spokesperson, I just remember what she told me.
And you know, I distinctly remember when I interviewed her at the Y, but I don't know if it was in 2015 for her book, The Doctor Is In, or if it was in 2019 about the documentary called Ask Dr. Ruth, directed by Brian White. But I remember asking her, of all the extraordinary accomplishments of your life, what are you most proud of? And her reply was, my grandchildren. And I see Leora right here. Is Ari here? No, okay.
Ari's in California.
Okay, okay. But it's her own experience, loving, being with, caring for, learning from her grandchildren that I think has fed into this idea. We are going to take questions from the audience in just a moment, but I'm going to ask this. She loved to use the phrase, don't retire, rewire, which was coined by Sherry Lansing. Do you think that this book was her way of rewiring in the last years of her life?
It's not just this book. Allison mentioned this, and it's really important to know that you'd think, oh, someone's Dr. Ruth, so all these opportunities come to her, and she decides which ones to do. That's not the way it works. Before she was Dr. Ruth, after she was Dr. Ruth, she made projects. She made things happen. Allison, said that there was no such position as the ambassador for loneliness. She made 1 million phone calls to make that happen. But long before that, she would, raise money to make a documentary about various things, and she did many of those. She would make a book happen. She would do all that, and so. Yes, this was one of many projects that was rewiring. I mean, she never wanted to sit still, but for her, that was a lifelong thing, was wiring in the first place.
Yeah, and she never retired. There was never a moment where I'm going to now move from this to rewire. She just, and social media and the technology, she knew nothing about technology. I mean, my mother, she never used a keyboard, ever. There was a fax, Pierre would get a fax, send her the fax. When people stopped sending faxes was a worst day of her, worst day for her. But she knew what technology could do. She understood that when you said you're going to tweet something, that a lot of things happened and a lot of people would call her and would know about things that they didn't know before. And she knew exactly the number of followers that you had. And one story that I just love, which shows how she knew how to use technology without understanding anything about technology, was one of the times in the last year I took her to the hospital, and as we're going into the emergency department, she said, "Do they know who I am?" And I said, "Hold on, they will, I promise, but give me a chance." And you were getting it. She goes, "No, they have to know they have to know who I am." And she calls over one of the doctors. And she says, "Take your phone and go and Google Dr. Ruth." So he leaves, does as he's told. And I asked her, "What does that mean, Mom? What does it mean to Google Dr. Ruth?" She said, "I have no idea. But I know that when I say that, people come right back and they want to take their picture with me."
Additional thoughts? Retire, rewire?
Well, I mean, she did lobby to get this ambassadorship, and it's State Senator Liz Kruger who's the one who was a key person to making it happen. And sadly, she had a stroke, so that she really couldn't be the ambassador. So when you talk about Rewire, the book was the way to do that. The book was something that could be, I mean, as I said, she had done 45 books, so she didn't need another book. But this book was important because it was the only way that she could be the ambassador to loneliness, since she really didn't have the energy to do interviews and go out on the road and do all the stuff that she otherwise would have done. And I think the world is a sadder place that didn't happen. But I think the book that we wrote was a good step forward, at least, you know.
And by the way, you asked a question about the process of writing the book. I don't know this for sure, but this must be the most quickly written and published book in the history of book publishing, which of course, don't quote me, it may not be true, but it felt like it was true because we signed the book deal in January and the book came out in September. And of course, that was not fast enough for your mom. She was famously impatient and would always ask Pierre and I, so when is this going to be done? And that was, our marching orders were very clear that it had to be done and done well. And she had these incredible life stories. When you read The Joy of Connections, there is so much of her own story that is just woven throughout the pages because she had personal stories to share, but also this professional expertise. And I'll just share one really brief story, and you know which one I'm going to share, is that when we were asked to get Ruth involved in the promotion, that was not very hard because you turn on a camera, iPhone or otherwise, and she popped up and ready to go. And so Penguin Random House wanted her to record videos for the sales team. The sales team at any book publisher is responsible for convincing bookstores to carry the book. Not every bookstore that gets published, as you can rightfully imagine, gets carried in every bookstore. So the sales team has to get to work. And so we set up a camera in the apartment, and she would lean forward, really excited to record this video, and she would say why this book, this topic was so important to her, that she was now the ambassador to loneliness and she had these lessons to teach. And then she would say, you know where this is going. And if you sell this book, I promise you, you will have great sex for the rest of your life. And so really, if you buy this book tonight, you will have great sex for the rest of your life.
I can hear her voice saying that. And by the way, having read the book, I can state that her unique voice comes through. Even though obviously the two of you worked very hard, the book has so much common sense and wisdom and humor and both personal and extensive approaches to life. When I was reading it, I could swear I was hearing her voice speaking it. So that's probably, well, first we'll take a few questions from the group, and then there will be book signing and selling right outside those doors, and this room will be reconfigured for the reception.
Can I just say one thing?
Sure.
Miriam and I had no idea that our mother was funny. She never understood jokes. She didn't do, stand-up routines at a party or anything. But when she lectured, these things came to her, and on the spot, she didn't prepare them, and they were hilarious. And she was funny. And when you watch her on talk shows and on everything, she's really funny. And so that was a kind of joke in our family, is that how did she become funny?
In the clip we showed, I love the moment when she says, this is me telling Donald Trump and Kim Jong-un that size doesn't matter. She would come up with these little zingers all the time, and they were pretty spontaneous, unless, Pierre, you were behind the scenes and I wasn't quite aware of it.
Oh, no. She when she was on television, she didn't prepare a thing. It was all spontaneous, and every talk show wanted her. I mean, David Letterman, it was constant, and she was tied with a comedian for the most appearances in Arsenio Hall, and the Tonight Show. I mean, she was everywhere, and that started right at the beginning. I'm going back through my diaries, and I started working with her in January. The first time I met her was January 30th, 1981, because I was doing PR for the station. By April, she was on the Tomorrow Show, which was a national show. Yeah.
Okay, we will take a few questions. I can see easily the first few rows, but with difficulty the back. So just raise your hand very high if you would like to ask something. And if not, I assure you I have many more questions. But my goodness, Ruth she would sit here, she would probably say, "Why you don't ask me question? Ask."
She would have told you to have little cards so that people could write their question down. So
Okay,
we
have one. And actually, I'm just going to say that Sally Fisher, who's about to ask a question, was so much a part of the life that Mark and I and my mother had with Dr. Ruth, because what she loved every year was coming with us to the annual Oscar party in New York. And it was usually Sally or a friend of Sally's who was having the Oscar party. So now you can go ahead, and I hope I didn't embarrass you.
No, I just want to say that you asked a question before that was incredibly pertinent, which was, what do you think that Dr. Ruth will be remembered for, or something to that effect? And, I just look around this room, and today we were talking to our family, and we were saying we were coming tonight, and there isn't a person who was in the group with us who didn't have a Dr. Ruth story. I danced with her here. I remember in Riverdale, it was just like people just, and it's not lost on any of us that we have lost somebody very special. And especially because you think of Ruth Ginsburg, you think of Ruth Westheimer, you think of all these women that cared so deeply about human rights and about women and about abortion. Hearing her talk, and just in the state that we're in now, I think that what she'll be remembered for, and what we need to all carry on, is the work that she worked so hard to do, which is connecting. You talk about the ambassador of loneliness, and in a way, it's even bigger than that. It's I don't know that she was lonely, but she gave everybody the sense that she was there for them. And so if we can all be there for each other in some way and make these next years easier, because just it's a mess. And she really represented something so incredibly caring. And the question there is, what can you brought up something wonderful in this new organization that you mentioned. And I guess that, this book, The Joy of Connections, will teach us all things about how we can continue her work. But I think each one of us can think of a way that we can continue her work and make the world a better place to live.
She would have loved to hear that.
Yeah. I would just add, there's science behind Ruth's choices that may have not informed, of course, her decisions to act the way she did. That seems to be organic from her. But when the United States Surgeon General put out his report about the epidemic of loneliness, part of what happens when you're lonely is that you start to feel like you don't matter. And the way you can slowly come out of that cave of feeling like no one cares about you is to volunteer in whatever it is that interests you, and be authentic about that. Don't choose to go read to children if you hate kids, right? Don't go to the gardening club because that's what your neighbor wants to do. The advice in The Joy of Connections is to actually look at yourself in the mirror. It's how Pierre started our conversation today, and decide what it is that you like to do, and do that. And do it with consistency and depth. Not broad, and you're volunteering in a million places, but one or two places. Commit to going at a certain time, at a certain place, because guess what happens when you go at a certain time, at a certain place? You will then see the same people who are also showing up at that same time in the same place. So it's not about breadth, it's about depth. It's about choosing something that you actually enjoy, And when you start giving back, as a Surgeon General advised, your sense of self-worth will start bubbling up again. And that's a recipe. So we can do that in honor of Dr. Ruth.
By the way, Ruth and I actually went to the Academy Awards in Los Angeles, and we talked about her being impatient. And so she said, we gotta go. And I said, Ruth, no, we're too early. So we got there, and she and I walked down the red carpet, but the cameras weren't turning. I mean, we got interviewed, she got interviewed, I didn't get interviewed, but we were there way too early. But anyway, I digress.
Mark?
One comment and one question. I did have a conversation with Dr. Ruth about the time when she was working for Planned Parenthood in Harlem during the 1960s. And she spoke about that period with as much commitment and enthusiasm and energy as she did about her time when she reached celebrity status. And I love that about her. But the question is, when she was on the radio, she was very popular on college campuses. And were you in college at the time?
Was he ever?
What that experience was like? Did you go into a corner? Just talk about
that. Of course, you can imagine people always ask me, or both of us, what it was like to grow up with Dr. Ruth. My first answer is that we didn't grow up with Dr. Ruth. It started in 1980, 1981. I was in 11th grade, 12th grade is when people started to know her. And so it happened. But by the time I was in college, she was large. By that time, I was old enough, I guess. I mean, I was really proud of her and happy for her with such a difficult beginning to her life. I was probably grateful that I wasn't in middle school. But there was one time, Mark, where I was out and I was coming back from something, and all of a sudden, it was late on Sunday night, and all of a sudden I heard from like every window of my dorm my mother's voice. I was like, Mom? It was like that Woody Allen movie where the mother is in the sky, everywhere. So,
which would have been bad enough, but she was talking about sex.
Exactly. So, yeah, there were a couple of times like that. The other was, maybe some of you remember this, there was a time in New York City when the taxi cabs had celebrities saying, buckle your seatbelt. And one of the celebrities was our mother. And so you would get in a cab and it would be kind of random, but it could be our mother saying to buckle your seatbelt.
So I have a funny story of that. We were at a restaurant, and normal families, we got into a little bit of an argument, and I ended up leaving the restaurant in a bit of a huff, and I walked out, and I get into a taxi cab, and there's her voice.
We have time for one more. Yes, I'm seeing someone on the aisle. Go right ahead.
Marvin Scott.
The greatest thing people leave us when they're gone are the memories. And I have great memories of Dr. Ruth. She was really a cultural icon. And I had her on my broadcast back in 1981.
Wow.
So, as I think Pierre said before, one of the things we're remembered for, she removed the taboo talking about sex openly. Before the 80s, you didn't talk openly on television or on radio. Sex discussions, you didn't hear about masturbation or anything like that. She talked openly about it. And there was a reluctance on the part of management at WPIX when I first had her on a program on Midday Edition. And we did an interview, we talked about sexual matters, but we talked about it in an adult way. And people responded to it positively. And I think that's the greatest legacy she leaves us, is the fact that we were not afraid to talk about sex after that, to this day. But also, there's another factor that has been brought up. She was a very strong voice for against anti-Semitism. I had done a number of stories with her, and she was on my program. And I did one with her at the Museum of Jewish Heritage with 9 other survivors of the Holocaust. As they walked through the Auschwitz exhibit. She talked about how she survived by living outside. She was not in a concentration camp. She lost her family member. There was so sensitive that she had this sensitivity about her, about everything she talked about. She had a great sense of humor. I'll never forget, we were at a party in Italy, and the theme was, come as your favorite Italian. And she came dressed as Charlie Chaplin. It's out there. She leaves such a great legacy, and I just had to share just a few words about Dr. Ruth.
Yeah.
In 1981, she opened the doors for sexual discussion, and that exists to this day. And I say, God bless her. And so glad she was part of our lives.
Yeah.
By the way, she had exactly one costume, and that was Charlie Chaplin.
And for those of you guys who can't see that far back, that is the great broadcaster, Marvin Scott. It is so wonderful to see you, Marvin.
We could keep talking for at least another hour, but I think it may now be time for book signing and a nibble and a sip. And I thank all of you for joining us, but especially Joel and Miriam and Pierre and Allison. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Annette. Thank you.
Thank you.